This next session is, our final topic is, how can the NFL and its players best serve the next generation? And our featured guest is DeMaurice Smith, the Executive Director, of course, of the NFL Players Association. We appreciate him coming by. He's also a trained lawyer, as opposed to an untrained lawyer.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, recovering lawyer. Let's go that far.
Right. Right. So, just very broadly, DeMaurice, I mean, what do you see the NFL and the NFLPA's role in this issue being? I mean, how much leadership should it show on pushing good practice and policy down to the grassroots, the youth and high school level?
Yeah, the way we look at it is it's not really a question of how much leadership we should show. We embrace the fact that whatever we do results in being leaders in the sport. So when you look at, for example, this new CBA, the fact that there are no more two-a-day practices, the fact that after week 11 there can only be one padded practice, 4 more padded practices, and then throughout the entire year there can only be one padded practice a week. The greatest thrill that our player leadership has is when you take a stand like that, when you see it start to be replicated in college sports and in youth sports. We didn't go into it with the idea that we were going to make these changes because we thought that we could be leaders in college and youth sports. We made the decision because we felt, A, that the medical science supported it, that it was a smart thing to do in order to make the game and the business of football safer. But most importantly, we do know that by having the opportunity to make good decisions, we know that those things are going to make a difference, and we know that when we make decisions like that, it's going to be reported. You'll have wonderful seminars like this where obviously you couldn't find anybody else other than me to sit in this chair, but it's an opportunity to be here. We know that those kind of things are going to be things that are going to be reported and talked about. So the way that our leadership and the way that I challenge our leadership is not so much to sit around and try to think of individual items that we can change. What we have tried to do over the last 4 years is think the right thoughts, ask the right questions, raise fundamental questions of accountability and responsibility, and then to take the best course of action that we can.
What about role modeling? How important is it for NFL players to show proper tackling technique? Because you've got all these kids out there watching, you've got youth coaches watching, and if they see NFL players leading with their head, maybe even complaining about being punished when they lead with their head, what kind of signal does that send? Well,
look, when I go into a locker room and for the next few minutes you're going to be treated to the way in which I talk to our players in a locker room. I expect them to be good men, good family men, good husbands, good brothers, good men in their community. And that's something that we've decided, again, as a group of leadership, that that's what we're going to demand among all of our leadership. So when it comes to your question of what players can do, we look at it far more broadly than just proper tackling technique. We now know that there are things that we can do to make the practice and playing of the game safer. And while there are a number of players that weren't happy with the changes, we made a decision as a group of leaders that was the direction that we were going to go. For example, changing the off-season for our players, where we call it the flat ball rule, where during phase 1 of the off-season training, we are in a world where there can be no running, no drills with a ball. Why? Because we wanted to make sure that during phase 1 that there was absolutely no contact. And while we talked about a number of different ways about making sure that coaches wouldn't have contact, we all know that coaches in the National Football League are coaches in the National Football League. And if we didn't have a hard and fast rule that prohibited or made contact completely illegal, that the creep would happen, that certain teams would start changing and start doing certain rules, and then you literally get into a quote-unquote arms race. So, ideas about having the flat ball during phase 1, let me tell you, not every player was happy with that. A lot of quarterbacks, a lot of our skill Position players called. They were certainly upset with me. How come I can't do this? How come I can't do that? The reality was, while it might be good for those individual players, it was not good for the 2,000 people who played football. So we're happy making decisions that sometimes make a smaller group of people unhappy if we do believe that at the end of the day, we again are in a world where we lead by example, where we hopefully achieve a world where our players can play longer, and most importantly, where they can play safer.
You know, we've heard a lot of talk today about heads-up football, again, proper tackling technique and so forth. What's your sense? I mean, do players support those kinds of initiatives, but maybe only at the youth level? I mean, do they draw a distinction at all and say, okay, that's good for the kids, but you know what, this is a man's game up here?
No, our players play the way they were coached. You will not find a player in the National Football League who believes that, okay, I was taught to do this in youth football, now I'm going to do something completely different in the pros. I mean, look, the reality of it is, while things like commissioner discipline, or while issues of illegal hits are the things that tend to make it onto ESPN every day, we can talk about that later. But the reality of it is, for every snap that we have, for the 22 people who are playing, more often than not, ESPN and NFL Network are not talking about illegal things that happen on the field. Those things don't make the news. So, no, our players don't believe that there's something that's good that they could do it on the youth level, and things that are, you know, certainly okay on the pro level. What we do have an issue with, and I think, again, the CBA and the last couple of years have tried to combat it, we know as a group of players how they are being coached to play. So the question sometimes that I think we have to ask ourselves, and it's one that certainly I've posed at times, when a player gets fined for the way in which he tackles, the one question I always have of our players is, which way were you being taught or coached by your professional team? And once again, maybe sometime down the road, ESPN and the players can get together and talk about those kind of things.
You know, you're a very effective advocate for professional football players, right? Who
Is that a question?
Well, it's a setup.
Okay. See, that at least you know.
A good kind of setup here. The point I'm making is that who's advocating for kids, right? And how do we build champions for kids and their interests? Is it parents? Is it a matter of arming parents with education? Is it I don't know, building the voice of kids into this conversation? How do we build champions?
How do we get
for
there?
kids? Yeah.
You know, I think all of us have an obligation. I mean, myself, while I don't coach football, I've coached my kids in sports from the time that they were seven years old, heading into the last year of coaching my girls' basketball team. And if there's one group of people that I'll crawl through glass for, it'll be my girls' basketball team. But that responsibility is one that comes from being a parent. It certainly comes from a person who believes in the lessons, the life lessons that youth sports teach. But look, you know, when I don't think that it's really a question of whether kids have an advocacy group for them. I think the benefit that kids all over this country have is that hopefully the people sitting around this table, the people who are watching at home, fellow coaches like myself, parents who believe in youth sports, all of those people are people who believe in the beauty and the benefits of sports. I mean, when you think of the things that we have accomplished in sports over the last, take 50, 60 years, those things really weren't accomplished because a particular group had a particular lobbyist working on their behalf. It would be great if youth sports had folks like Jeff Miller working on their behalf. You know, another great advocate, but really when you look at all of the issues that have made sports great in this country for kids, you're talking about people who just took it upon themselves that this was better for society. When you think of Title IX, When you think of ways in which even in the last 2 years, practices have become safer for kids. That didn't happen because they happened to retain a great law firm or a great advocate group to represent them. I think society, parents, and everybody got together and said, what's best for the people who are playing this game, and shouldn't we be doing better? And when we do that, I do believe that we're actually capable of adhering to our better angels and actually accomplishing things that are great in our community and in our society.
How much do NFL players, how much do they support reform at the lowest levels? I mean, do they
When you say youth levels in college?
Youth in high school.
Oh.
Youth in high school level. I mean, do they look and say, yeah, something's broken, or do they look and say, hey, man, that's just football. That's how I came up. Get over it.
No, I don't know of a parent who would look at it that way. I mean, can you imagine a world where I might do something between 9 and 5 during the day, and let's just say again that I'm a day laborer or I work as a boiler for a manufacturing company, where I would say, well, what I do at work is fine, but, if things are less safe for my kids, well, hope it all works out for them. Nobody thinks that way. Our players don't think that way. Every guy that you will ask in our locker room will tell you that they love the game of football. And it's not so much that I think that they would look at it like we look at the NFL, that things are fundamentally broken. The conversations that we have in our locker rooms and in our team meetings are not whether things are a mess or not. The fundamental questions that we discuss are what can we do to make things better. And to me, I think it's a mistake to think that you will ever get to a point where you are comfortable or satisfied with the current state of safety, or even the current state of almost anything. I mean, isn't our goal to be constantly jealous and constantly upset and eager to find out more information, to develop new practices to make things safer? That's where we want to be. So the conversations that we have in our locker room are from a group of guys who certainly care about their sport, but I got to tell you, they care a heck of a lot more about their kids and their neighbors and their friends, and trying to do anything that they can to make this game safer.
What are specific measures that are being discussed? The NFL just donated $30 million to the NIH to fund research in the area of youth sports and youth football in general. USA Football has ramped up their efforts. I know you're supportive of USA Football's efforts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Pop Warner.
But what is the PA? What could it do that it's not doing right now that maybe has been discussed?
Well, there's 3 or 4 things. And first, let me start off with where I believe we all have to be. It is thinking about new ideas and coming up with what I believe is the right way of thinking about the role and the world of where an athlete fits in. One of the most fundamental changes that I think that you've seen over the last few years in professional, in the NFL, is our refusal to believe that we start looking at our athletes as football players first and people second. When we sit around this table, all of us obviously have been to some doctor at some point in our lives. We believe, all of us hopefully believe, in things like informed consent, because we believe that those are things that every patient is entitled to, regardless of whether they're an athlete or not. So when we move in that direction in the National Football League, I'm happy to have those conversations with folks in Pop Warner as well, because we believe that just like they do, we should look at these young kids as who they were before they became athletes. When it comes to issues like ensuring that coaches are certified, that's an effort that we've been involved in really for the last 20 years. Because again, I played football in high school with what some people would call an old school coach. Any man in this room or woman who played football who doesn't cringe when they hear "bull in the ring" is a person who is a lucky individual. But the reality was that's the type of football that I grew up with. When we are talking about efforts about educating coaches about what's safe and what's not safe, that's something that we do on every level. We probably have over 200 players who run some sort of off-season football or speed camp. I can tell you that none of those players run or have camps that have practices that wouldn't fly in the National Football League. So again, as we go forward, I do believe that it might be this issue of culture change. I know that's a little bit of a buzzword, and I do my best to stay away from buzzwords. But things like culture change, things like pushing an understanding of where an athlete fits into this paradigm. But the last thing, to be blunt, is also this issue of accountability. One of the things that we have strived for in the last 4 years is this issue of increased accountability. And if there is any one aspect of what we do on the pro level that I hope gets replicated on a college and youth level, it is this issue of accountability. For example, this CBA is the first one in history that obligates team medical professionals to adhere to every federal, state, local, professional, and ethical standard. Now, the good news is that that's now in this CBA. The bad news is it took until this CBA to actually have that done, which is a little staggering, but I guess you have to start somewhere. But with respect to our ability to file grievances against team doctors where we believe that their care has fallen below a certain standard. Again, issues of informed consent are big ones for us. And are there a couple of issues that we're still fighting with between ourselves and the league on that issue? Yes. For example, I don't believe it is morally acceptable that you force a player to sign a waiver of all liability before some sort of medical attention is given to a player. I believe that's morally indefensible. So on those instances where we're dealing with teams that have forced our players to sign waivers of liability, those will be steps where our union will seek to hold those medical professionals in the league that pays them responsible for those things. But again, those are big-time issues where you might not be able to find one particular program or one particular act like
Right.
no two-a-days.
Right.
But that is a fundamental sea change in the culture or philosophy of football that is really a product of the last 3 or 4 years.
Right. So what we've seen is essentially an evolution of what the standard of care is, right, for the health and safety of NFL players.
And the
You're,
and the expectation of that care.
and the expectation.
Because
of care.
those two things go hand in hand. Because it is one thing to say that if someone messes up the standard of care, you will hold them accountable. It is quite another to have as a parent where you now have an expectation of accountability. You have an expectation that the coach will be certified. You have an expectation that a neutral physician will be making a call about whether a player can continue to play. And that expectation, to me, is in some respects even more important than the level of accountability.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's there are all these. There is that standard of care at the NFL level that you've ramped up, but a lot of youth leagues can't afford doctors and trainers and neurologists sitting in the press box. So how should we think about that? Now that we know what we believe is appropriate for adults, how much of that do you think should be pushed down the pipeline to kids versus, hey, they just simply can't afford it, so let's not even engage in that conversation.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about the economics, and that's certainly a big issue. I mean, look, I grew up in D.C., grew up in Prince George's County. The Little League or Pop Warner or Boys and Girls Club team that I paid for did not have a trainer. If they did, we called him coach. And if it couldn't be solved by rubbing dirt on it, it was not fixed. But I do think that, going back to this expectation issue, I know that what we've done and what people like Chris and Robert and others have done to talk about youth sports is making a difference on the youth level when you can talk to parents, as I have now, who are concerned when they believe their kids might even have a sub-concussive event, where they, instead of just shaking it off in the old days where, whether it was my parents or somebody else saying, well, what you have is a stinger or what you have is just a little bit of a nick, you're going to be fine, just sit down and sit this play out. Those were the old days. When you have parents and coaches now who know that it's not good enough to just say that a kid is going to be okay, we don't even have to take a look at him, I know we've made a change. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I do believe that where we can ensure that players are getting the right medical attention, that's key. But I also believe that this education piece, where we ensure that parents have a greater expectation of how their kids are going to be taken care of, that's critical.
Got it. I'd like to bring others into the conversation, but one question before we go. Dr. Cantu, as you know, supports no tackle football before the age of 14. Your thought? Do you support that or no?
Well, I've read I read the piece that was, again, I'm going to make some paper unhappy that I didn't remember the name of the paper, but I'm sure it was one of yours. And I read some of the backup literature. I think it's worth looking at and studying because, again, I tend to read everything, and I tend to certainly want to know what the scientific underpinnings of it is, and I think it's worth further study. I mean, to me, the questions are always going to be evidence-based. And if that's where, anywhere where the evidence leads you, I think that's where you make your best decisions. So I think it's something that's worth looking at and worth studying. At the same time, however, I'm always worried that if a particular individual reaches some point about, okay, this is where the bright line is, it doesn't mean that we should stop thinking about all of the things that we can do to make sure that our current efforts are as safe as possible. And that, to me, that is really the one, probably the only danger that comes from scientific knowledge, is if it leads people to believe that they have permission to stop thinking about something else. I mean, for example, my son is a lacrosse player. My daughter is a soccer player. Even if that is true, I don't want us to think that we should stop thinking about ways to make lacrosse safer, soccer safer. And again, because we know that kids will still want to play tackle football from ages below 14, does that mean we should stop thinking about how do we keep those kids as safe as possible? My hope would be everybody would say no.
Gotcha. Mark Heim, give us your credentials, Mark.
I'm a friend of Dr. Cantu's.
He's also the author of a couple books on youth sports.
And in full disclosure, I did teach his class a couple of days ago.
I wouldn't say you taught my class. I would say you were a guest, and a very good one. We've all read comments from NFL players, past and present, indicating that they would not allow their children to play tackle football. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of your conversations. Are those unusual cases where players hold those views, or is that a more typical view among players?
Which conversation are you talking about?
Well,
the ones
player-
with the players
players
or the
who-
ones with my kids?
Players who will say to you, I don't really feel comfortable with my child less than 14 years old, playing tackle football.
I've had conversations with lots of players who have their kids play, and certainly conversations with some parents who say they wouldn't. Instead of drawing any wider lessons from any small group that I would ever talk to, I'm sure that's not what you would teach. I think that the real issue is the candor and the fact that parents should be empowered to make the best decisions for their kids as possible. So I don't really look or really place much significance on a broader level about the safety of football, given what an individual player might say to me. We've got 2,000 players in the National Football League. There's probably 10,000 former players. So to me, the real thing that I look for in the way in which our players relate to their sport and to their family is I love the fact that these parents who might be players or former players are thinking about what's best for their kids. And that's where it begins and ends. And I can tell you that the great part about my job is while most of people in America see our players between 1 and 4 or 4 and 6 or on Thursday night or on Monday night, really the pleasure that I have is I get to deal with them once the TV's off. And on a Monday, they probably have a tough time coming down the steps to shake hands with me. But when the TV's off, they're parents. So at the end of the day, the lessons that I draw from having those conversations are lessons that while they might be supermen on the field, they're the same guys who hug their kids like I do every night.
I'd like to bring Dave Zirin into the conversation. Look, he's a hero. He's on his knees.
Yes.
Wow.
You're like in Vince Lombardi's huddle or something, you know?
Just literally, not politically. First, I feel like I should say to Christine, Mike, and the other working sports writers in the room that Mike Brown just got fired, in case you have to run to your desk. Okay. Second, some hot sports news just over Twitter. Second is,
Dave, tell us who you're with. And,
oh, yeah, Dave Zirin. I'm the sports writer at the Nation magazine. I host a show called Edge of Sports Radio. D, my question for you is, given everything we've seen over the last several months in the NFL season, when I say that, I mean given the continued push by the NFL for an 18-game season, given the regimentation of Thursday night games, which a lot of players don't like because they feel like there's not enough rest and recuperation playing every Thursday night, and given the replacement referees, which, as you commented, created a very unsafe working environment for NFL players, do you feel like you have a working partner in Roger Goodell and the National Football League in creating a safer game?
I do. And Dave, obviously everybody around the room knows that when it's time for a quote-unquote dust-up to happen between the commissioner or Roger and myself, it typically happens. It also means that we have separate constituencies that we represent, and sometimes we see the world through two different lenses. Our job, as I said earlier, is to push this issue of safety and accountability. I will tell you, sitting here right now as the executive director of this organization, that there will never come a day when I will be pleased or simply resigned to where we are on the issue of safety. I think our job, both of our jobs, is to continuously look, to strive, to push to make the game safer. Are there issues that we disagree with? Absolutely. We believe that there should be, for example, sideline concussion experts in the National Football League. Why? We believe that there should be people who are trained in diagnosing and healing concussions. who are going to be at the sideline of every game, who only have one job, and that's to look for the possibility of a concussed or a subconcussed player. If you remember what happened to Matt Schaub, for example, that issue was one where we, even immediately after the game, there was a question about whether or not he had suffered a concussion because the doctors who were there to treat him missed the play. So by having a person who has as their only job somebody on that sideline to make sure that happens, that's something that we, the players' union, believe should exist. The league disagrees. Does that mean that it won't be resolved? No. But sometimes it takes us a little bit of time to get to that middle point where we're, I wouldn't say both happy, sometimes we're just mutually unhappy.
I'd like to bring Jeff Miller into the conversation. Jeff is the vice president at the NFL, represents the league here. Let me ask you, Jeff, how critical is this issue, football participation at the youth and the high school level, to the NFL's long-term growth?
Sure. Well, let me start by making a little bit of news, and that's to say that I agree with quite a bit of what Dee said.
Now that you need to run and go get the papers.
I didn't say all. So quite a bit of what Dee said. His dedication to player health is commendable. Like the Players Association, we sit on the board of USA Football. Dee is a board member himself, and the contributions that the Players Association makes along with the league to USA Football and a lot of what they do is going to address the question that you just posed. Activity in the youth sports, whether they be playing football or other sports, is essential as a public health issue. We all appreciate that. It was a conversation that we had this morning. We want kids to play football, of course, tackle football, flag football. We want them to play. We want them to play lots of sports. You know, I think this sociology around playing one sport seems, counterintuitive to what's good for our kids. As the parent of two young children, that just doesn't make any sense to me. But of course it's important to the league, and getting back to a question that you proposed to Dee towards the top, what responsibility do we have as the Players Association and as the league? The answer is, of course, we have an obligation. We embrace that obligation. We take that obligation seriously, and in everything we do, we realize that what we do will be mirrored at other levels of sport. It didn't take very long after we decided to move the kickoff line up 5 yards for other sports to follow. That's a small example. Small maybe in the sense that it was only 5 yards, and maybe is just a minor rule change, but it decreased the incidence of concussion on that play by 40% in 1 year. So while we look at rules changes about hits to the head, why we penalize players, why we fine players, why we try to change the culture, that trite phrase that Dee referenced, all of those things are followed at all levels of sport, and that's important. That's relevant. We have a platform when 100 million people watch our games every weekend and see what the players do on the field and how the NFL reacts to it. I think that you're kidding yourself if you don't think that you have an obligation. And that's one that you have to take seriously. And so when we hear questions raised by Dr. Cantu or others about the future of sport and youth sport, those are places where we want to engage. That's a reason that the NFL recently gave $30 million to the National Institutes of Health. Much of it for neurological research. That's the reason that Dee and the NFL set aside $100 million over the course of this CBA for health research. That's the reason that we cut down on the practices. Mm-hmm. These are things that the players advocated for and the NFL was receptive to, and that will change how football is played at all levels. Now, it goes beyond that. It can't just be settling the model. You can't just say we do this and now everybody will follow. You actually have to put your actions where your words are. And there was an issue this morning, a theme that came up a lot about education and a lot about infrastructure, I think was a term that was used, that would help parents, teachers, coaches, those at the youth sports level. Well, because they don't have the athletic trainer in the sky and they don't have the neurologist independent for players to see, those resources don't exist to the same degree. And so what can you do? It's an issue that we have faced. We're proud at the league that we've invested with the CDC, as is the Players Association, a great degree into a terrific set of campaign materials called Heads Up, which are easily available and need to be pushed out further. We're pleased that, even though it caused me to spend time in Pierre, South Dakota in January, that we've been able to get 40 states to pass youth concussion laws. Now, not us alone. Our friends over here with the American College of Sports Medicine have been terrific advocates as well. But when parents receive that information sheet and coaches learn that they have to be educated in concussion, and when the law states that children have to be removed from play when they've been concussed and have to see a qualified licensed healthcare provider before they return to play, these things make a difference. And so the obligation that the league has as a platform is relevant to this conversation. It's important, but it's not all that you can do. You also have to put your money, your time, your advocacy, and pursue the education to make sure that these things change. And I think that while not any individual part of that is a panacea, all of it put together, if people are on the side of sports, whether it be on the professional level or the youth level, is going to help change the culture over time. And so that as a parent of young kids, I will see it before my very eyes. And so the conversation as we have it here and as it will continue does not need be dire. What USA Football does, what the Players Association does, what Dr. Cantu does, what Pop Warner does, these are all important, relevant parts of the conversation, but one that I'm optimistic about. And as a league representative, it's one that we can continue to push.
One of the things we've heard about a lot today is coach education and coach training. You know, the NFL and the PA had a great tool to address that question called the NFL Youth Football Fund. I wrote about it a couple months ago. It was getting funded to the tune of $25 million a year through 2006. Funding got cut off. Ever since then, the funds have been drained. If it had been continued, if it had been funded at that level up to now, you might have $150 million you could throw at getting every coach in the company, in the country trained, perhaps, mandating it, paying for online courses, maybe in-person courses. I know you guys have been thinking about, okay, how do we bring more resources to this question? So I guess what's happening with the youth fund? Is that going to get refunded? And if not, are there going to be dollars thrown at the issue of helping the Pop Warners of the world get coaches' education mandated?
Your premise is misstated, to start. With the Players Association and a previous CBA, we allocated a great deal of money to the Youth Football Fund, one of the NFL's two charitable institutions, for the purpose of promoting youth football. That money was set aside at an early date with the purpose of spending the money down over time. So it wasn't that we cut off the money, it's that we planned ahead. So that's very different than what you said. Now, the second piece to answer your question is, in the most recent CBA, we chose a different tact with the players in terms of charitable contributions. They have their own set of what they're going to choose to do. I leave it to Dee to talk about that to the extent he wants. We set aside, as part of the negotiation, $276 million over 10 years for philanthropic institutions. We recently have given a great deal of thought to how we're going to use that money. We've chosen two primary initiatives: the health and safety of the game and youth football. I'm not trying to break news here, but our commitment to youth football, whether it be with the players and setting up USA Football, whether it be through the Youth Football Fund or through the negotiated element that I just discussed, has been unwavering. Is it important? More so now than ever, given public perception? I'll let somebody else have that argument. But nothing is going to change in that regard. Scott can talk to that in terms of what the contributions he's received from us and the players have been. And I'm sure that Dee could talk about it as well. But there's money set aside. It's important. We believe in youth football and we'll continue to support it.
Yeah, I mean, one of his most compelling ideas, I think people would agree, is this, get the coaches trained at a regional site, then they go back into their community league, and they're almost like they teach everyone else, and they serve as a check and balance, and they're not a coach in a league. Compelling, but that costs money, right?
It does.
So someone has to underwrite that. Do you have any thought on how that's going to happen?
Actually, both parties are talking about helping to underwrite that. In fact, excuse me, we're looking at every conceivable model, including potentially covering the costs of all coaches to be trained. I mean, we're looking at that. Right now, it's $5 a coach. I mean, again, I think that's an important statement. $5 a coach, and it's nationally accredited. It dovetails. It includes practice plans, some membership. Actually, it's not even just a coaching education course. So we strive, and Kendall, we can only do this as an advertisement. We can only do this because of the contributions of the NFL and the Players Association to allow us to put systems like that in place and ultimately spread them out across the country. I mean, $1 million worth of equipment grants, thanks to the NFL and the Players Association. $500,000 subsidy for background checks, thanks to them. The only reason we can offer for $5 is because it's a lost leader, and it's because of the support we get from them. I mean, candidly, I think one of the questions that should be raised is, everyone seems to always ask me, well, what's the motives of the NFL and the Players Association to do this? I mean, I guess they can speak to that better than I can, but where is the rest? Where is all the other organizations out there, stakeholders of football? Why aren't we all unifying and working together to address this issue financially? Because in the end, you're saying the right thing. We need to find a way to help coaches be trained. We need to find a way to get people on the ground that can be there to supervise, assess, verify, et cetera. And I think we do have systems and plans to do that, but it does take funding.
Shannon Shai is with the American Youth Football, which is one of the largest youth football organizations out there. A lot of independent leagues are affiliated with your group. Now, tell me what you're doing about this issue. I know you guys, for instance, have not supported Pop Warner's idea of limiting practice time. You have your own ideas on how to reform youth football. Talk to me.
This is a really important, critical meeting, and the conversation needs to continue. I will tell the NFL, what you do does have a big impact all the way down. I've been in youth football since 1999 as a coach, as an administrator, and now I'm on a national staff. The concussions right now is on the tip of everybody's tongue, and that's really important. A couple of things. I heard sort of a theme in the first hour or two about maybe football is not so much about teamwork anymore. It's losing its zeal. I think that's absolutely false. We take kids from underprivileged neighborhoods in the inner city, very privileged kids. All of them learn the same lessons, that help them in life. So we should never minimize the importance of that. For concussions, I will tell you, we applaud what Pop Warner is trying. For us, we're trying to take a look at this, limiting, practice is already limited during the year after school starts. Our fear for saying you can only hit for 40 minutes of practice is that the coaches are now going to say, okay, we've got 40 minutes, let's go hit. And it'll drive them to that. What we tell them, don't spend your time hitting, spend your time teaching, technique and everything else. So we'll see. We're not saying that that's wrong. We're just trying a different approach. We're all after the same goal. The other thing is, I can't ever imagine, although the research is critical, I can't ever imagine a time when we turn around and the federal government and the state's government outlaw football for 14 years and younger. We should really spend our time finding out what the research said, like Dee said, and then trying to figure out how to make it as safe as possible, right? And working with USA Football and Pop Warner, the result is going to be extremely, extremely important for the future of the game. But the other thing is, on the education piece, what we found is teaching the parents. Teaching the parents is critical. When I started, we had all kinds of parents saying, I know my kid, he can go back in the game. And you say, ma'am, your child cannot go back in the game. Parents are now aware, and they're not making those kind of decisions. The other piece of it is on coaches training. We need to really get the coaches out there to teach other coaches. We can handle everybody in our organizations, but we really have to do a better job as a whole nation about going to the places where there isn't a national structure. So.
Got it. I want to bring Brooke DeLynch into this. Brooke, tell me about your website, and are you working with the NFL? Is that right, on an initiative?
We are helping. Yes, we are actually helping with the NFL evolution. So each day you see some of the tips from Mom's Team, which I am the publisher of in that site. I am also the author of Home Team Advantage, the critical role of mothers in youth sports. And I have a great new hat. It is as a producer of a documentary around football. And I keep hearing these great pieces by Dee and others about parents. So yes, Mom's Team is the website that I run, and for the past 12 years we have been leading the way, I believe, in concussion education at the youth sports and high school level.
Moms are concerned, aren't they?
Moms are very concerned. As a matter of fact, about a year ago, 9 months ago, I received a letter from a mom in Oklahoma, and she wanted Mom's Team to parachute in with our team of experts to set up a concussion risk management program. And that is a very common question that we have received over 12 years is, can you help us? We've been helping right along, but this time we wanted to document every step of the way. One of my triplet sons actually was taken out of football because of concussions years ago. And now, knowing what I know, the game can be made safer. The game is being made safer. So very quickly what we did was we parachuted into Oklahoma. We've been following a team for the entire season. We started in February, and each month we visit them for a week. We've been filming them. Their concussion rate has plummeted. We've put together our risk management program, 15 different steps. We have the accelerometers. The hit sensors are in their helmets at the high school level. So we are tracking hits. We are tracking everything that these boys want. We have been able to give them new helmets, not just the correct fit, but how to measure it. Most important message I have is that the kids want the accelerometers, either in their helmet or as an earbud or a mouthpiece. They want that responsibility taken away from themselves.
Got it.
So right now they're under-reporting, and this is really helping.
Good. Let me bring Bill Mayer into this conversation. Bill, as I mentioned, is an owner in the UFL, and you have a unique perspective on the downstream consequences of concussions and other injuries that, I mean, they're sort of placed at your doorstep, aren't they? Talk to me about that.
Well, I think unlike a lot of people, you end up learning about something sort of from the back going forward. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's the cost of workers' compensation in football. And it is a real problem. Part of it's the state of California and how it's structured to take claims. But the insurance companies, you in effect self-insure. Now, the point is the cost of workers' compensation for our little league is we had to go through the states, and it was about 1.5 times the entire compensation of the players. Okay, and we had a conversation recently with the National Football League, and I think if you ask them, they would tell you it's a similar problem. Well, why is that a problem? Well, people think of course, the concussion and inheriting where a player played last, the whole thing. And nobody objects, of course, because there are players that have been hurt. But if you go back and you say, all right, if you want to change this, guess where you end up? You end up where Dr. Cantu is talking about. And then I say, well, wow, we basically have an entire generation we're going to have to deal with, because who knows, somebody playing in the Southeast Conference has perhaps already incurred damage that isn't going to manifest itself for 15 or 20 years.
Right. The point is that you, I think you were telling me that the last team that employs the player is the one that picks up all workers' costs,
Yeah,
right?
and that's not right or wrong. That happens to be the law.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I mean, I'm interested in your conversations, as I always am, with the National Football League about how they could be in the same situation. One thing that's different in our CBA.
Oh, I'm not speaking for the National Football
Oh, okay.
League.
But the great thing under our CBA is the cost of their workers' compensation insurance is actually borne by the players. So we actually live in a world under the CBA where the insurance cost is basically estimated every year, and that is a benefit that goes to the team. So the good news, at least for our football teams, and it's always rare that I'll say something good about NFL owners, but this is one of them, is that when it comes to their cost of their insurance, it's something that's reimbursed. Now, the world that we live in that makes it somewhat ironic is even though those costs are reimbursed, the teams nonetheless fight us on workers' comp, which is interesting. I could probably choose another word other than interesting, but it's a family show. So I'm always interested in this issue of workers' compensation, but I do think that, going back to these big ideas, recognizing that when our players get hurt, our leadership refuses to call it an accident. If you are a running back and you're squaring up and Ray Lewis is coming at you, or if you're a cornerback and Steven Jackson is heading towards you, what happens after you tackle one of those individuals is not an accident. That is a necessary and foreseeable consequence of something that we call playing football. Right. And the day that we actually turn the corner on making this game better for youth is the same day that we recognize that players, when they are engaged and they get hurt at work, not playing a game, hurt at work, when we accept that responsibility and choose that we are going to compensate and take care of those medical injuries for those players who get hurt at work, that's a day that's going to be much better for youth football, because we will have moved beyond that sort of quote-unquote gladiator phase of football where we all used to say, well, you know, if a guy got a broken leg, well, it just happened and that was tough for him and we just should move on. Those days need to end.
Let me finish. Of course, that's why they call it workers' compensation, because it is work. My point was not necessarily workers' compensation per se, but as a symbol for the cumulative impact of trauma from the youth. And so we talk about 100 million people watching football and watching your players that you represent on the field working, all right? And they are the role model for youth sports. And so part of what you do is going to obviously influence youth sports. So you've got to work at it, my own point, from both ends.
Absolutely.
And my last point is that something I said at the beginning of my comments. You know, I'm a big fan of looking at trends as opposed to snapshots. And so you weren't able to join us that early, but you know, it's clear that the discussion is different than it was 3 years ago about this whole issue of youth sports and the risk up until, call it 14 years old, when the brain in the shell is fully formed or may be fully formed. And yes, you need a lot more research. But I can tell you from the standpoint of logic, it's very clear to me that this has to be viewed as a threat or an opportunity. And clearly, most people would say in any situation where things seem to be changing or we're learning more information, you would want to be in control of the situation and help drive the decision as opposed to being outside of the tent. And so, you know, there are big differences of opinion here amongst everybody that's doing this research for the 7 to 14-year-olds. But I would sure hope you're working together, because the outcome is going to be what it is, and sooner or later there will be a point that is commonly called, Malcolm Gladwell calls it, the tipping point. And tipping points are usually reached not necessarily by individual votes, but because there is some person that has an abnormal amount of influence on the opinion of others. Who that is, and that person is probably in this room.
I'd like to bring two NFL players into this conversation. I'll get to you, Eddie, in just a second, but I want to go to a former NFL kicker named Stefan Fatsis. Wrote a book about kicking in the NFL. Stefan, give me your thought on what you've heard.
Well, I did. I spent a summer with the Denver Broncos as a kicker on the team, in the locker room, on the practice field. I was never hit, because if anyone had ever hit me, I would not be sitting here today.
That's a concussion-free position, you know. Just about.
I did have a tight end coach insist that I approach a tackling dummy one day, and I got hurt. I didn't tell anybody they got hurt. Like most NFL players, they don't tell anyone that they got hurt. Now, I think there are 2 points that I wanted to make, and one is that the reality, both at the professional level and the youth level, is far different from, I think, some of the scenarios that we are laying out here. Players are not, for all of the excellent and progressive changes that D has managed to get in conjunction with the NFL, players are still at the mercy of their coaches. They are still unwilling to tell doctors when they're hurt. They are still unwilling to demand their medical records when they have rights to them. They are still unaware of the long-term consequences of many of the injuries that they're asked to play through. That's a long-term proposition to change the culture of the league, and I know that there are efforts being made to do that. But players aren't willing to just make those changes overnight because their livelihoods depend on getting back out on the field. At the youth level, kids don't have those spokesmen. Parents are terrible. They are, I think, the worst judges of what their children need or are capable of. Coaches in most sports are uneducated, and for all of the educational opportunities and efforts you make, there's still going to be the majority of coaches are not going to try to implement these things. We're talking about a sport that you're talking about putting accelerometers in equipment, where we want equipment specialists to outfit our children, where we're talking about having independent observers of coaches on the sidelines at practices and games to monitor what's going on. I'm going to throw out a general question, which is, at what point are we kidding ourselves about youth football? That this is not a sensible proposition when you need this superstructure of equipments and medical testing and trained medical observers for every youth football game in the country. At what point, and maybe the lawyers decide it, maybe the school boards decide it, maybe the journalists decide it, but how do we know we're at that point?
I'd like to hear from Eddie Mason. You want to respond to what
Yeah.
Stefan?
First, D, thank you for the work that you've done for the players. I wish you'd have did it 10 years ago. I would have still been playing. But limited practices, all that type of stuff, league, everybody, all the officials here. As I stated earlier, the main thing about youth sports is safety. I think we all agree that we need to make the game safer on every level, from youth, high school, college, to pro. And I think there's been many measures doing it. There's been a lot of research, a lot of discussion here. Appreciate the research you guys are doing at Virginia Tech. But the reality is here, we live in a football community. And it's everybody's responsibility in this room, that's why we're here. Tom, thank you for bringing us all together, to come together to, embrace the research, embrace the wisdom, embrace the knowledge, have people that will fight for change and represent. Perfect example. As I stated to you earlier, I'm commissioner over a flag football league, and I'm also work with 3 tackle leagues in the Loudoun, Virginia area. The reality is this, is that in the football coach, we're always taught to fight through it, to go that extra mile, to keep working, to keep pushing. And then there's that breaking point, as you talked about earlier, that tipping point of where you have to come to the realization of, okay, who do we leave this responsibility, hands of this responsibility into? And at some point, we have to take that responsibility away from the coaches and even the leagues, because many of the leagues that I work with are parent-run, are owned. They're not governed by USA Football or Pop Warner. These guys can't come down. Scott can't come down there and tell every coach in the United States of America that this is the way you need to do it. So what we try to do with the league, and I just want to share this as an example of this is what you're fighting against at the grassroots level, is number one, Coach Kerry Campbell and I, who played 9 years in the league, I played 8, we went to a league, we approached the league, and we said this, you know what we want to do? We played at the highest level. So there's a model standard. It's already out there. The NFL and the NFLPA have already set a standard for youth coaches in America. The problem is they don't embrace the changes because it's all about winning. It's this win at all cost mentality. Now, winning is good, but guess what? Nobody remembers W's and L's years from now. What matters is the effects of the game. And so what we tried to do with the league was, okay, if you guys want to improve safety and you want to improve, making sure that these coaches are responsible, being accountable and credible, then implement a league czar. Just like the NFLPA. They protect the what? The players, right? They work alongside with the NFL to come inside and they say, okay, these are the things that we want to give. These are the things that are most important. These are the issues. And that's what needs to happen is there needs to be some, and it may have to be legislative. I don't know, but if we're serious about making changes to the game and serious about making safety paramount at the youth level, then we need to get serious about, okay, if these issues exist and these league presidents don't want to make changes, then your league can't exist. Your league cannot exist. You are irresponsible, and you're being irresponsible to these families and to these kids if you are unwilling to adhere to the standard. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's about a standard. And it's about raising that standard and expectation and then implementing it. And if we don't do that, then it's going to continue to be the same. And yes, you're right. 15 years from now, little Jimmy, little Johnny, yeah, might be having some problems if we don't all come together as a football community. That's what this is all about.
Mike Wise, how hopeful, we've heard a lot here today, and you're a good listener because you're a journalist. You're also a skeptic.
Yeah.
You're a journalist. Yeah. How optimistic are you that the culture of football can change, that we can get coaches trained, that quality decisions can be made at the youth level, that high schools can use football in a way that promotes public health?
It's a tough one because while I think this is a start and a huge start, and Dr. Cantu's work is seminal, and a lot of the things said today here are very important. I'm a little disappointed that Eddie is one of the only players here. I would love to see more active players be a part of this. And I think if there is, and I think DU said it best, I don't think culture change is a bad watchword at all. I wonder from Jeff's perspective, and these just, is it possible for the league to get it into the thick heads of guys whose job is to hit people, people like Ray Lewis, like James Harrison, who've used some of this new culture of not killing the quarterback and calling it the sissification of the league, and people who say snitches get stitches during Bountygate. Is it possible to come down on these people? Is it possible to get it through their heads that it's not okay to hurt your fellow competitor? It's one thing to lay a guy out. I'm like anybody else. I have a reptilian brain. I jump out on my couch when a guy makes a big hit. But when that player stays down, it's as sick as anything I can remember. I was at the AFC Championship game a few years ago in Pittsburgh, and when Willis McGahee went down, Ryan Clark laid him out. Nobody thought Willis McGahee was getting up. And so I don't know if there's a PSA thing where, like Grant Hill came out and said, using gay slurs are bad. If something can happen like that in the NFL, where Ray Lewis and some of the most violent hitters in this game can come out and say, point blank, kids, this ain't right. It's one thing to knock a guy down. It's another thing to want to willfully hurt him. I think the culture change needs to start at that level, and I don't know how. Like, if Colt McCoy is allowed back on the field, what it all means.
Yep. And I hear you, and I think that's a great point. But again, going back to responsibility and accountability, and you and I had a good chance to chat a little bit outside, and my feelings about the importance and the obligation of smart journalists and good journalism in America, and that's a debate, thankfully, that people are having again. But, my question is always, while you identified two individuals who said things that I would rather they not say, I'll be dead honest with you. I have to hunt for a story about a guy like Mike Vrabel, who was as vicious a linebacker as possible, but coaches youth football in the way that everybody in this room would want to coach him about. So to me, again, going back to the fact that there are 2,000 football players in the National Football League, if we wanted to come up with the worst examples of things that happen that we would wish not happen, my guess is we would be numbering in the 10s and the 20s, not the thousands. So, as I look at guys like Steven Jackson and even guys like Ryan Clark, those are guys who I think do it the right way when it comes to teaching their youth football people. So while I agree with you 100% on the idea of PSAs for those things, but you know what? I'd love to have a little bit of good news coming out about some of the players who you never hear about because they don't drive their car at 1,000 miles an hour. They don't get in fights at clubs. They don't throw people out of windows. Unfortunately, those are the stories that we never hear. And the good thing about Jeff and I's job is, again, once the TV's off, those are the guys that we meet. And to me, the greatest PSAs that we could possibly do, and I'm putting a little bit of this responsibility on us as well, and more importantly, the head of our communications department, George, in the back of the room, is for us to tell those stories, because we have thousands of great ones. And for the guys that you played with, Eddie, for those guys who were on your teams, more often than not, those are the very same guys that you would entrust to teach your kids how to play football. And that's the stories that we need to hear.
Mike, let me if I can just jump in real quick on what Dee said. I'm sorry, Tom. I'll be brief. Dee makes a good point. The stories that you get, the Colt McCoys and other things that lead to further evolution in how we address these issues are essential that they be told. They're essential because they lead to changes, and the game has to continue to evolve. Would we have athletic trainers in the skyboxes and video boards on the sidelines? But for that, I don't know whether we would, but it helped. But what's interesting is that last year in the championship games, the NFC and AFC championship games, two hard-hitting games. The Ravens played the Patriots, the Giants beat the Niners, and then in the Super Bowl, go back and watch those games. Was there an illegal hit? Was there a penalty for unsportsmanlike conduct? Were all the hits hard, solid, making your reptilian brain jump off the couch? There were. Go back and watch. I present to you, and I don't know whether Dee would agree, but I present to you that it is changing. James Harrison said publicly that he was going to avoid hitting the quarterback in the head because he didn't want to draw a fine from the league. So anecdotal
That's big.
is not statistic. Yeah, and I'll probably get in trouble back at the league when I mention some of these things, but anecdotal isn't proof. But then again, those stories also exist. And the great part about football, those hard hits that you're excited about, they can be done. And they can continue to encourage the following of the fans and that part of us who enjoys hard hits. They don't have to beat anybody's head either. And that does exist.
Gotcha. We need to wrap up here, and I'd love to get to everyone who's at the table. But I'd like two quick closing comments from Scott, and let's go to Bob at the end.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the idea that getting players engaged is very important. And actually part of, and this is not an advertisement, I got to be careful, but the three pilot programs we have with Heads Up Football, one of the aspects that was really beneficial was that former or NFL alumni players came out. And they were genuinely presenting their feelings about the game. And they were talking openly to the parents. LeVar Arrington in particular came out here in Northern Virginia, and it made a real difference. And so I think one of the points that you made is, how do we all sort of come together and get the message out and talk about what we know, and as we learn more from the science and the medical industry and so forth, that we obviously have to embrace that and act accordingly. But I am pleased with the Players Association and the NFL, and that they're encouraging their players to come out and engage parents and talk about the realities of what's going on. And parents are asking some real hard questions. But in the end, they want to be informed. And so I think there is a movement. The point of this statement is there is some proactive steps being taken to try to address this very complex issue. And obviously the conversation needs to continue. But at the foreign player level, they are definitely engaging.
Well, Bob, you got this conversation started with the whole idea of 14 and under in flag football, so I'm going to give you the final comment.
Thanks very much. Let me just wrap it quickly by saying what I started with. Thank you, Tom, for having us at the Aspen Institute. I think it's great. I think it's important all of us in this room understand that no brain trauma is good brain trauma. We're not paranoid about it, but when you can reduce it, or every chance you get to eliminate it short of stopping something completely, it's a good thing. I'm very encouraged with what I've heard today, because I think the bus that's been driving has been at the wrong end. I'm proud as heck of what the National Football League has done, what Commissioner Goodell has done, working with DeMaurice Smith and the Players Association collectively, what they did in their collective bargaining agreement, reducing the hitting to less than once a week. But that's not been picked up significantly at lower levels so far. And I'm speaking now, let's forget me getting on my 14 and under bandwagon, let's just say college and high school. And we've just come back from Zurich, where we've been on the organizing committee representing the United States since '01. And the big thing 4 years ago was for youth football, 18 and under, no going back into the contest the same day. That was the mandate coming out of the conference. Nothing happened. Nothing. 2009, nothing. 2010, the National Football League implemented that, and within months, the NC2A lockstepped and the National Federation of High School Football Associations lockstep. The National Football League has been driving this safety business, and it seems to me that we need to have a little, yes, it's great they're doing that, but the youth leagues need to step in a bigger way than they have in the past. I'm delighted to see what they've done recently, and I applaud it.
Okay, so a couple things before we go here. Like I said, a transcript of today's proceedings, if you want to call it that, will be available later in the day. They'll be sent to me. I'll take a look at them, then I'll send them out to folks if you're interested. I'm sorry we weren't able to figure out the video clip earlier, but we're going to show it now after. You're welcome to stick around. If you want to head out, that's fine as well. It's about 10 minutes. It's from our head games panel at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Jim Brown and others are talking about some of these issues. That show, the 1 hour show, will be on World Channel on November 20th at 8 p.m. So check that out. There's also a DVD at your station, which you're free to take home, which is of the show. I'd like to thank everyone who helped bring this meeting together. Most of all, Jeff Harris, there he is right there. Give Jeff a hand. Nina and Tarek in the back. Jim Spiegelman, who is always a supporter of everything we do. Bill Mayer, who is a great advocate of our program as well. And all of you who have engaged in this conversation. As an investigative journalist, people like Donovan Hill or Preston Plevrides, who suffered from second impact syndrome, they talk to me because they want something good to come of their story. They want people to learn from what happened to them so it doesn't happen to someone else. And it's the kind of journalism that fleshes out those stories is essential, but there's another component. There's something that happens afterward, and it's conversations like these where important people come together, share their perspectives, try and find common ground, identify breakthrough ideas, and we're able to advance the conversation moving forward. So for me personally, I feel like I'm doing right by the Donovan Hills of the world by helping convene this. So thank you for coming.
Tom, I have to. If I can just interject 1 second. I flew out here because you said I could ask Dee one question.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I hate to speak out of turn, but sure. I am a concerned parent. I've interviewed you. I've interviewed 4 of your executive committee members. These gentlemen are the ones who are most adept at speaking to this issue. You mentioned the fact that we should have more player representation here. I appreciate everything you've said to me today. In interviewing your executive committee members, one of them told me on this issue, point blank, there's no way in hell he would let his kids play football. That person has decided not to be part of the documentary, so I will not mention his name. He is an active player. I interviewed Drew Brees on this subject, and he signed a release, so I have no problem saying what he said. He said that he would not allow his children to play football, wouldn't even consider it until they're 13 years old. Earlier you spoke about morally indefensible, informed consent, accountability. Is it not his job as being part of the executive committee member focusing on player health and safety? Shouldn't he, as a Super Bowl champion from Texas, tell kids under 13 years old, more specifically tell their parents, I wouldn't even let my kid play till he was 13. I wouldn't consider it. When he's out doing these concussion clinics, shouldn't he be given this information? Isn't it incumbent upon your players to talk about this publicly?
Well, thanks, Sean. I will tell you this. I'm going to answer your question, and then, one, because it's my anniversary, and two, because my own son is going to get a sports award in a half an hour. I'll be brief.
Okay.
I'm not sure you'll ever find a man who cares more about the community and certainly more about his family than Drew. So when
but this is about our families. This is about our kids, not his kids.
When he talked to you about his decisions as a parent with respect to his own kids, I'm never gonna comment or second guess what decision he would make for his children. And if and when he wants to make a broader statement, about his own personal beliefs. I know Drew pretty well. He's not a shrinking violet about anything or anyone, and I'm sure he will.
Isn't it his responsibility,
so
though,
excuse
as
me.
playing
So
this game as a role model,
Sean,
that he has to tell people this?
Let me finish up. So when it comes to a person that has certainly played the game at its highest level, who certainly has done things for a community that I could only hope to do